Welcome to this episode of Grassroots Advocacy. The topic of today's episode is being your resident's voice. Now, before we get into the material for today, I want to remind you about last episode. During last episode, we were talking about the election process, the midterm election process. And please, I just want to take an opportunity before we move on to really encourage you to get out there, to participate in the electoral process, to cast your vote, to be part of the fantastic experiment that is our democracy. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to get into our topic today. And what I was provided a scenario recently by a dear friend, and it really gave me the opportunity to think about what would I do if I was in that situation. And so I'm going to use that story that was related to me by my friend, and I'm going to talk about some different techniques and some different approaches that you might choose to use if you found yourself in a situation similar to that. So let's take a look at that scenario. You and a teammate enter a room to provide care for the people who live there. You are caring for Mr. Brown. He is in the bed closest to the door. Your teammate is caring for Mr. Green. He is in the bed closest to the window. Your teammate goes over to the far side of the room and pulls the privacy curtain closed. You both begin the process of providing care. As you are tending to Mr. Brown, you overhear Mr. Green saying, "You're hurting my ribs." Your teammate mumbles something. You continue to address the needs of your resident. A few minutes pass and you hear Mr. Green cry out, "Stop, you're hurting me." What do you do? Well, as a caregiver, as a voice for the women and men that you serve, there are a variety of different approaches that you could choose to take. The one thing that I would encourage you not to do is to do nothing. Because some action is required here on your part. So as you think about this situation, you may have encountered something like it similar in your past. It's valuable to think about how you approach this issue, because if you approach it in a positive and constructive way, you're likely to get a good result. So one thing you might choose to do is you might choose to say to your teammate, "Hey, Johnny, I know that Mr. Green recently had a fall and he may have bruised his ribs," to reinforce that there may be a reason for this pain. Or you might choose to say, "Hey, Johnny, I'm just about finished with Mr. Brown. Would you like me to help you? It sounds like Mr. Green might require some additional care today." Or you might say, "Hey, Johnny, I realize that it's about time for your break. If you want to go ahead and leave Mr. Green and I'll finish him once I'm done with Mr. Brown, then that will give him an opportunity to step away from that situation, and that will give you an opportunity to help meet Mr. Green's needs." And that's really what we're all there for, is to make sure that the needs of the residents are being met. So you provide your teammate, Johnny, with some options so that he's able to get back on track, so that he's able to deliver the type of care that Mr. Green deserves. Now, let's move on to the next piece of the scenario. Your teammate does not react to your suggestions. Instead, he continues to perform personal care for Mr. Green. Mr. Green continues to express that he is in pain. Your teammate sounds like he's becoming agitated based upon his comments to Mr. Green. What do you do? At this point in the situation, it's going to take a more active approach to make sure that Mr. Green receives the care that he deserves and that his rights and his dignity are not compromised. So one approach you might use is you might say, hey, Johnny, I really need your help in the hallway. Please come with me. And then you could take Johnny out into the hallway and you could say, Johnny, look, obviously there's something going on with Mr. Green and we're going to have to provide care in a way different than what we typically would do. Or you might have Johnny in the hall and say, look, Mr. Green is obviously in a state of discomfort. Why don't you take a break and I'll get with the nurse and let the nurse know that Mr. Green is in discomfort and see what she'd like us to do. Maybe she'd like to give some pain medication. Maybe she'd like to come down and assess the situation. So basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to, in a constructive way, separate Mr. Green and Johnny from that situation because it's not productive for either one of them. Because as we noticed in the scenario, you could tell that Johnny was starting to get agitated and starting to get frustrated because of the different things he was saying to Mr. Green. So another way you could potentially approach this situation is by bringing Johnny out into the hallway and suggesting that you swap residents. Hey, Johnny, it sounds like maybe Mr. Green needs some kid gloves today. Why don't you finish taking care of Mr. Brown, and I will take care of Mr. Green. And that way we'll be able to, meet both of their needs and we'll be able to do it in a time-effective manner. So what I'd really like to encourage you to think about at this part of the discussion or at this part of the scenario is, what are the ways that we can achieve our desired outcome, which is quality care, and do it in a way that's beneficial, first and foremost, to the people who are receiving care, but also to us as caregivers? Because it's quite possible that as Mr. Green becomes more and more uncomfortable, he may start to be resistant to care, and that's not going to be helpful for him. So now let's go ahead and move forward with the next piece of this scenario. Once you re-enter the room, you go over to Mr. Green and you make him as comfortable as possible, and you explain that you will complete his care in just a few minutes. You return to Mr. Brown and complete his care as quickly as possible. Then you return to Mr. Green's attention. As you are finishing up his care, he states that he's hurting pretty badly. So what do? Well, that's a great question. The first thing that you need to do is you need to notify the charge nurse or the nurse that's responsible for your area of the center. You want to let them know that the elder has a complaint of pain. You want to let them know what you were doing prior to his expressing complaints of pain, what was happening during the delivery of care, and what you have done as a professional caregiver. Now, as you're relating this information to the nurse may very well immediately go down to assess the resident to see what their level of pain and discomfort is. Secondarily, they will probably want to know more about the actions of Johnny and Mr. Green as they were engaged in the process of care. As a professional, you want to share your observations. I'd encourage you to avoid making assumptions or elaborating on things, making them bigger than they are. There's no need for drama here. But it is very important that you state the facts and that you provide a good constructive observation of what occurred. Now, this may generate some sort of internal discipline within your organization. It might even generate some sort of complaint investigation by your state survey organization. Those things aren't necessarily bad because they give us an opportunity to learn what we can do better in future events. Now, let's say for the sake of discussion that when you present this information to your charge nurse or your shift supervisor or the person who's responsible, the nurse who's responsible for your area, And let's say that for the sake of discussion, you want to do some follow-up. Well, you might wait a day or two and go back to that nurse and say, hey, I just wanted to follow up and see what's happening with Mr. Green. What are we doing to address his pain, or what can I do differently as I'm delivering care to make sure that Mr. Green is not uncomfortable? That gives that nurse an opportunity to give you feedback to say, okay, so I did an assessment. I called the doctor's office. The doctor ordered a medication to treat the discomfort. And we are going to, as we're delivering care, we're going to use a number of adaptive devices to make it easier and less likely to generate pain. This lets the nurse know that you've accepted some level of responsibility for the outcome of the situation. Now, let's say, for the sake of discussion, that the nurse says that she didn't talk to anybody about Johnny. Actually, pardon me, I was about to misspeak. Let's say, for the sake of discussion, that the nurse doesn't mention anything about Johnny. That's okay. Some organizations' human resource policies and procedures require that information not be shared about disciplinary action that's taken on a person. So if the nurse doesn't mention anything, please be careful not to assume that they didn't take any action, because it's quite possible they did, and the regulations or policies and procedures just prohibit them from sharing anything with you about that. What you can do to follow up as a caregiver is you can watch how Johnny is delivering care in the future. And if Johnny's way of delivering care improves, or if the way Johnny delivers care is more appropriate for Mr. Green's needs, then you can consider that you have been successful as being a voice for Mr. Green, or for any resident, patient, elder for that matter. Now, on the flip side, if you notice that Johnny's performance hasn't improved, I would encourage you to review your center's policies and procedures as it relates to a grievance process or the reporting process for incidents, just so that you understand what your organization, how your organization operates. And so that way you can comply with or be inside those policies and procedures. And ultimately, it is important for us to realize that we have a responsibility. You have a responsibility. We as citizens all have a responsibility to safeguard the well-being of frail, elder, and disabled citizens. And so I don't imagine that it would ever come to this, but if it came to a situation where you felt like the person was not receiving the care that they deserved, and you had done all that you could do within your organization, it might be appropriate for you to make a complaint to the state. But like I said, I don't anticipate that would necessarily have to happen, but it's just so that you know that is an other step that one person might take. So this scenario, I don't believe this situation happens as often as the news might lead us to believe. That being said, if we have some plans, some contingencies, some what-if scenarios that we can think through, that will help us to better react should those situations arise. I appreciate you sharing your time with me today. As we conclude our episode, as we always do, I'd like to share this quote with you. This quote comes from Theodore Roosevelt, 26th President of the United States. Great thoughts speak only to the thoughtful mind, but great actions speak to all mankind. Speak and act on your elders' behalf, and you will be a true professional. I look forward to being with you for the next episode of Grassroots Advocacy.